The Indian EV market is expected to grow from $3.2 billion in 2022 to $114 billion by 2029.
Would you like to see India rid of diesel and petrol cars altogether?
100% मेरा मिशन है.
The Indian government expects that by 2030, EV sales will account for 30% of private and 70% of commercial vehicle sales. And this is good news for the EV industry in India. But the good news ends here, because there is one aspect of the EV sector that you may have overlooked. It is currently dominated by China.
There's a new king in the EV world. That's right, Elon Musk's Tesla is about to lose its crown. And who's the new king? China's BYD.
Because the US and Europe have been going after China recently for unfairly propping up its electric car industry.
About 85% of the world's batteries are currently produced. The materials come from China.
Chinese EVs currently make up 60% of the global EV sales. So if you randomly pick two EVs anywhere in the world, one of them will be made in China. But their domination goes much deeper. Batteries account for 40% of an EV's cost, and China controls that part of the supply chain as well. The world's top two EV battery makers, CATL and BYD, are both Chinese, and together they account for over 50% of the world's battery production. But Chinese domination still goes a step deeper. China also owns the processing of raw materials and minerals required to make these EV batteries. It owns 35% of nickel, 65% of lithium, 75% of cobalt, and almost 100% of graphite in the global supply. And India is in a spot of bother. The country's imports of ready-to-use lithium-ion batteries have nearly tripled in the last 4 years, and 85% of those came from China. India currently imports 100% of its lithium, and 95% of it comes from China and Hong Kong. The local lithium production is literally zero. You would think that Tata Motors is the flag bearer of the Make in India EV revolution of our country, right? But even Tata Motors gets its EV batteries from Tata Autocom Systems, which is a joint venture between Tata and the Chinese company Goshuan High-Tech. So be it Tata or Ola, the raw materials are coming from China. And what else do you think they can do? There is simply no alternative. But how did China secretly manage to gain end-to-end control of the EV battery supply chain? How did India, the US, and Europe fall so behind in the EV race? Can India do anything to stop Chinese batteries from flooding the country, or is it already too late? To find out the answers, let's understand how China established complete dominance in the first place. While it may sound unbelievable, EVs have actually been around for 2 centuries now. The first EV was created way back in 1828, but the range of EVs was always a problem. Batteries were not good enough to support longer ranges. And with the popularization of the IC engine and the discovery of vast petroleum reserves in the 1900s, EVs were sidelined for almost a century, simply because there was no need for an alternative. But in the late 1990s, something happened. A new device was popularized that would change the way how humans communicate, and that device was the mobile phone. As mobile phones became more and more popular, there was a sudden demand for better batteries. The lighter and longer lasting a phone's battery was, the more it would sell. But the existing nickel battery technologies of that time had severe limitations, and companies were suddenly incentivized to spend heavily on research and come up with better batteries. So the 1990s saw heavy investments in the development of a new battery technology known as the lithium-ion battery. But by the early 2000s, these lithium-ion batteries had become so advanced that people realize something. If a smaller lithium-ion battery could power a mobile device, then a larger battery could power automobiles as well. So Elon Musk and his Tesla Motors eventually popularized their use in cars and vehicles around 2006. But the role played by mobile devices cannot be emphasized enough. BYD, the largest EV company in China today, actually started as a battery manufacturer for mobile devices in 1995. Now, you will be shocked to know that even until the late 2000s, China was nowhere in this picture. Lithium-ion batteries were pioneered by Sony for their camcorders and laptops, which is a Japanese company. In fact, Japan had an absolute monopoly on lithium-ion batteries. The top 5 global battery companies until the late 2000s, including Sony, Panasonic, and Hitachi, were all Japanese. But by 2020, China had become the leader in EVs, EV batteries, and battery raw materials. So how did China manage to go from zero to absolute monopolization of the sector? The The answer to that question is the single biggest lesson in the importance of having a business foresight, because China started the actual work to become a monopoly way back in 2001. You see, in the early 2000s, China was experiencing phenomenal economic growth. Their annual GDP growth rates were often exceeding 10%. The growth was leading to an increase in energy demand across the country, which meant an increase in demand for crude oil as well. In 2003, China surpassed Japan to become the second largest oil consumer in the world, only behind the US. So China was on track to become the largest crude oil importer in the world. But this dependence on oil imports for energy security started worrying the Chinese government, and they devised a long-term strategy that would change the global energy landscape forever. See, China knew it could never compete on ICE engines and crude oil back then. Other countries had already monopolized them. So instead of focusing on the present in 2003, they decided to focus on and dominate the automotive and energy sector 20 years into the future. In their 5-year plan released in 2001, China began prioritizing R&D in electric vehicle technology. From 2006, China started pilot programs in several cities to build foundational EV technology and infrastructure. And to give a boost to the industries, the government started giving out heavy subsidies, cheap land, and reduced tax rates. But the government's support for the local companies did not end there. To give EV makers an instant market, the government started giving huge contracts to electrify public vehicles. To give you an example, one of the first bulk orders that BYD received was from the Chinese government itself, where it received a contract to supply 16,000 EV buses in the city of Shenzhen. And this was before BYD became the largest EV seller in the world. But China was very careful between balancing foreign investment and protecting local manufacturing. For instance, China made a rule that if Ford and Tesla were making EVs in China, then they will have to use Chinese-made batteries to qualify for subsidies. And just like that, from 2009 to 2023, the Chinese government gave local EV makers over $230 billion as aid. I repeat, China gave away $250 billion to the EV sector in 15 years. The result is that as of today, China produces roughly twice as many EVs as it needs to meet the domestic demand. But what you will find even more shocking is their extremely deep ownership of the entire battery supply chain. See, a battery that typically goes into an EV is called a lithium-ion battery. The most important minerals to make these batteries include lithium, copper, nickel, cobalt, and graphite. And over the past few years, Chinese companies have started acquiring mines of these minerals all around the world. The result is that China controls a significant portion of the world's mineral mines needed for these batteries. So no matter where the mines are, the true ownership is of China. For instance, China only has the world's 8% of lithium reserves in their own country. The rest is all bought. But where China really controls the supply is in the steps after mining. Once these raw materials are mined, they need to be refined to extract the desired minerals from them. Then these minerals need to be turned into components that can be used in the battery. And no matter who mines the minerals, China refines the majority of them. Of the world's total supply, China processes 35% of nickel, 65% of lithium, 75% of cobalt, and almost 100% of graphite. And then they also have a head start in the final assembly of the battery. In the last 4 years, the world has spent $300 billion on battery manufacturing plants like gigafactories. Out of this, China accounted for 74% of the investment. So China controls the mining, refining, and manufacturing of EV cells. And experts say that American companies will take 5 to 10 years to catch up, while India might take even longer. So does this mean that India can do nothing but watch helplessly as China capitalizes on its EV boom? Well, not exactly. See, trying to capture mining in the supply chain is a long shot and cannot be done immediately. India has almost zero natural reserves for mining. But there are some ways in which India could reduce its dependence on China. See, this is how the final value of a battery is determined. Let's say that the final price of a lithium-ion battery is 100 rupees. Out of this, 20 rupees is accounted for by unrefined raw materials like lithium ore. 40 rupees is the cost of refining and processing the raw materials into usable battery components, and another 40 rupees is the cost of putting together those components and making a ready-to-use battery. Now what India is doing right now is importing ready-to-use batteries from China. So almost all of the money in a battery's value chain goes to China. Now India does not have the raw materials and mining capabilities. So we have no other option than to give those 20 rupees for unrefined raw materials to China. But if India can develop the capability to import these raw materials, refine them locally, and then manufacture the battery in India itself, then there is a scope for unlocking an additional 80% value for Indian manufacturers and suppliers. So we could potentially cut down our import cost by 80%. And this sounds like a great solution, right? We import the bare minimum of what is needed and do the rest on our own. But it is easier said than done. Building factories in India to turn minerals into usable battery components has two major problems. The first is the upfront cost. Building a single factory to produce components for a large battery plant requires billions of dollars in investment, and we need multiple such factories. But the second and more concerning problem is that even after building a factory, you may not find buyers. See, batteries are unique differentiators for EVs. Similar to how you cannot put an iPhone's battery into a Samsung phone, Ola Electric cannot use graphite that has been made for Tata's EV batteries. So it is not as if these factories can just start creating generic graphite or lithium that can then be used by all EV battery makers. Before you start producing battery components, you need buyers who can commit that they will buy from you, give you a contract-backed order, and even pay some upfront amount. But as of today, Indian customers prefer Chinese suppliers because they have the latest technology, they provide the best prices, and their deliveries are really quick. Because Make in India and nationalist sentiments are important, but no private company will risk buying poor quality or expensive components for their batteries just to support local manufacturing. Indian suppliers and manufacturers are still learning and developing their expertise, so it will still take some time until they can stand up and replace Chinese suppliers. The government is already acting in this direction. The 2024 budget allowed duty-free imports of critical metals like lithium, cobalt, and nickel. But there is one more rising opportunity that India can still capture. It is an opportunity that can single-handedly decrease India's future imports in the EV sector, and that is battery recycling. Lithium-ion EV batteries typically last for 7 to 8 years, after which they need to be retired and replaced. But the chemistry of these batteries is such that with the right recycling methods, you can recover up to 95% of the raw materials from that battery. So all of that lithium and copper and other minerals can be extracted and reused, reducing the overall need to import new minerals from China or any other country. Currently, India's capacity to recycle batteries is about 2 gigawatt hours, but the Niti Aayog estimates that new batteries will create a recycling volume of 128 gigawatt hours by 2030 as the industry expands. So India's battery recycling capacity needs to increase by over 60 times in the next few years to tackle these volumes. There is a huge opportunity right there, and the Indian government as well as manufacturers need to act on it soon. Subscribe to my channel below if you made it this far, and follow me on LinkedIn and Instagram. The link is in the description below. Until I see you in the next video, goodbye.